All right. Hello, everybody. We are here to talk about the Sphinx. Who built it, how it was built, what it was built with, and specifically, we're going to take a look at the geoarchaeology of it. And so I'm joined by Bob Schneiker, a geologist, and Dan Fallu, a geoarchaeologist. So, Bob, you don't usually work with archaeology. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background and why you got interested in the Sphinx?
Sure. I'm a geophysicist. I've got a master's degree in geophysics from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And for my day job, I have developed contaminant transport and modeling software that's used by regulatory agencies to develop soil cleanup standards. And you can do that site-specifically, so there's reasons to do this. And I also do training sessions on contaminant transport and fate modeling. And in that regard, sometimes what can happen is that the water can wick up and evaporate. And for whatever reason, that's a difficult process for the geologists and engineers to comprehend. So I saw Mark Lehner on NOVA, you're showing the photo right now, and he was explaining how the groundwater is wicking up and salt crystals are forming in the surface. They build up pressure and cause the rock to exfoliate. And that produces the erosion that you can see on the side walls of the Sphinx enclosure and on the Sphinx itself. And I was just going to use the Sphinx as an example. And that's what got me in all of this.
Huh. Absolutely fascinating. And Dan, I actually know you. We published together on soil science. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and why you think archaeologists in general need to do more geosciences approach in geoarchaeology?
Sure. So I have my doctorate from Boston University in archaeology, but I focused in geoarchaeology. I should try to explain a bit what geoarchaeology is, and really simply put, I'm an archaeologist who applies geoscience methods to different archaeological questions. And I've done most of my work in Greece. I work a bit all over Europe now. But what you're seeing right now is to kind of give a bit of the why geoarchaeologists do what we do and how we do it. This is a site called Schneiker. When it was discovered, it was in the news. It's this ridge-shaped island covered in marble terraces with houses. Dates back roughly actually to the period of the Sphinx, even probably about 2,500 years BCE. And the interesting thing about it, there's no marble on the island, and so this inflamed the imaginations of some people, wondering how far it was brought. And so they asked a geologist to come in, and the geologist took a look at it and said this probably comes from the island of Naxos, and not too far away, just two islands away, not a bad trip by canoe. But more importantly, they actually applied some geology knowledge and actually took a look at the stone on the island to understand that it had certain features, certain characteristics, so that they could search through Naxos and find the right place. And lo and behold, when they really focused on these characteristics of this tabular marble that was probably sandwiched between other types of stone, they find a little protected harbor called Volikas, where if you go just up the beach, where the stone hasn't been eroded away by the water, you find these accessible, easily breakable slabs of marble that they could have just pried out with sticks into easily transportable blocks and then transported to Schneiker. And that took a little bit of application to understand where to look on the island. And a lot of people will think that some archaeological scientists use fancy machines like this XRF analyzer, but sometimes it's as simple as understanding some rules of geology, stratigraphy, rock formation, and knowing where to look. So that's kind of why I do what I do. It just provides a different perspective, and it kind of helps set certain rules for answering archaeological questions that archaeologists might not think of intuitively.
Great. This makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I'm a zooarchaeologist, so I study ancient animal remains. So I apply a lot of biological science and organic chemistry to the archaeological record. And so I think it's key that everybody understand archaeologists are scientists. And so as the archaeologist here, I guess, though Dan's also an archaeologist, just a quick introduction to the Sphinx, and the question that we're going to try to focus on as we answer a few along the way is actually how old is the Sphinx. There are no contemporary inscriptions from it, but archaeologists are sure it dates to either Khafre or Khufu. The earliest mention of it is the dream stele found right by its paw, but that's from 1,000 years later, right? But the answer that archaeologists will all give you is it's the context of the site, right? The Sphinx is embedded within the context of a larger monumental landscape. And so that helps us understand, in particular, its spatial relationship, for example, to the pyramids of Khafre and Khufu, and the entire Giza necropolis itself. And we can, of course, date these pyramids and structures around the Sphinx. The Sphinx itself is difficult to get any radiocarbon from because it's carved out of the rock. There's nothing else there, but there's charcoal that's been found embedded in the blocks of the pyramids, in the Sphinx temple. All the radiocarbon dates date to approximately that time period of these people. As well, there's inscriptions inside, for example, the Great Pyramid that mention Khufu. And then, of course, I just want to point out that these pyramids are tombs. We have the sarcophagi, after all, in the pyramids, so we know that they were conceptualized as tombs. But last of all, there's kind of a stylistic argument that archaeologists make. The Sphinx looks kind of like Khafre, right? And so that's an important argument that we should not just throw out, but I'm not sure if it necessarily proves anything. This must be Khafre instead of Khufu, for example. We don't have any real nice statues of Khufu, for one thing. But the other thing is the stylism in general. It could just be any pharaoh, because this is, for example, a statue of Djoser. And if you notice this headdress, people might say, oh my God, if the Sphinx dates earlier, as Robert Schoch argues, maybe the pharaohs copied the Sphinx's style. But the earliest example of a headdress is from the very first dynasty on this plate from Abydos. And so we know when this style started, and we know that the Sphinx is part of this style of Old Kingdom pharaohs, and that we can be sure of. But okay, let's think about the geology of it. You talk to people on the internet or at sort of public outreach events, and everybody brings up this idea of this erosion of the Sphinx. What do you think about the erosion of the Sphinx? And they all point to the geologist, Professor Robert Schoch. He's a professor at Boston University, and he presented a paper with John Anthony West. They argue that this erosion, the eroded surface, the weathered surface, proves that it's older. The thing is, though, is that everybody's taken a widely different stance on how much older. So, Bob, I was hoping, I know that this is one of the things that got you interested in the Sphinx as well. You've mentioned it in your public talks. Can you tell me what about this specific argument, sort of the weathering and the erosion, drew you in to speak up and do some research?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not so sure it was the weathering or the erosion. It was the realization that the archaeologists, the Egyptologists, probably know what they're talking about, and that it isn't older. And if you're going to instantly, as Robert Schoch has, instantly jump to saying it was a lost civilization, I sort of felt like I was a doctor coming on an accident scene, and I needed to do what I could. So I think that probably more than anything explains why I started looking into it. But yeah, when you're looking at the erosion, I mean, it is commonly assumed that the Sphinx has been eroded. Yeah, right there. I mean, and that photo in particular was one that really clinched it for me that something else is going on here. Because if you look at the neck, you can see how eroded it is. Yeah, right there where you're pointing with the cursor. That is like, that couldn't be precipitation. So I'm looking at this and I'm puzzled, going, well, what in the world could be creating that type of erosional surface? And at that point now, I'm sort of intrigued to say, okay, no one can figure this out. I'm going to take my stab at it and see what I can do. I don't know if I said that. So in 2014, I presented a paper on how the groundwater is wicking up at the Geological Society of America meeting in Vancouver. And I chose that because Robert Schoch and especially John Anthony West always calls it the Super Bowl of geology, that they presented at that. So I was like, okay, I'll present there too. But I really quickly realized that process right there could only account for some of the erosion near the base of the Sphinx, on the sidewalls, and especially on the southern sidewall, but in general, the sidewalls of the Sphinx enclosure. For those who don't know, the Sphinx is actually mostly today below grade. So if you were to walk there and look at the Sphinx, you'd see only the head is sticking up above the level of the surface there. So anyway, so I'm looking at that going, okay, so that's not it. I'm going to figure out why. And that's when I started looking back, and it was extremely frustrating because I couldn't find any reason. Most archaeologists are assuming that the Sphinx was eroded and then repaired with blocks, like you were saying on the Dream Stela. We have Thutmose IV is describing that he did repairs on it. So most of the archaeologists, Egyptologists, are saying it was somewhere between the time it was carved about 4,500 years ago and about 3,400 BCE that all of this erosion occurred. But the geology, the climatology says that's impossible.
I want to think first about the stones that the Sphinx is even made from, right? It's not just kind of Robert Schoch that gets involved in the pyramids and the Sphinx. Can we actually prove with geosciences that the Sphinx, the stone that it's carved from, the limestone, is not from Mars? Could it be Martian limestone?
It's definitely not Mars.
Wrong color.
Why is it not Martian limestone then? Why is there no limestone on Mars?
That's a really interesting question. If you found limestone on Mars, you almost certainly have found evidence of life. So you're not going to get limestone on Mars, and I don't know where that currently stands. I don't follow it that close. But yeah, so you're not going to find limestone basically on Mars. It's a totally wrong kind of environment. As you're pointing out here, you've got these pictures where you're seeing it's a very fossiliferous limestone that the Sphinx is carved out of.
That would prove that in a sense it's from Earth organisms that it's made from, in a sense, right?
Exactly. It is extremely fossiliferous. What's really interesting is that fossil there is Nummulites gizihensius. I don't know if you know this, but that's actually an Egyptian god, is based on this fossil, as is one of the ancient games, Mehen. And it's the snake god, and it's a game. And the board pieces have been found, but exactly what the rules are, nobody's exactly sure. But it's also an index fossil. Well, so what it is you'll see that there's actually a point where almost all of the fossils go extinct. So if you look at that orange section up at the top, below that, in the yellow, you see all these dots, and those are different types of fossils that are within the limestone. And when you get to the head, all of a sudden, all of those fossils are gone. Mm-hmm. So something changed, something abrupt happened between the body of the Sphinx and the head. And that's an event that I was talking about 40 million years ago. It turns out, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but the evidence is pointing to it, that was actually a global climate change event called the Middle Eocene Climatic Optimum. And when I first saw that, I thought, okay, now I've become as crazy as conspiracy theorists. There's no way, because there's a whole series during the Eocene of global warming events. And the biggest one was the PETM, and it wasn't found until 1991. And for one of those global warming events to actually have been exposed in the Sphinx is just, that's like insanely, the odds are so against this even being possible. So somebody needs to go there and look and see if that's going on. But so the George Reisner, the Egyptologist, he mentioned in 1942 that he believes that the layer from which the head is carved and the top of the head basically marks the top of the Giza. It's called a plateau, but it's really a cuesta, or maybe what you could call it an anticline. And so that means that if the Sphinx were carved prior to the quarrying of that limestone to build the pyramids, not just the head, the body, but the entire Sphinx would have been carved below ground surface. So that's kind of like the starting point for this. That slide, all that rock should be tilted.
Yeah, it should be have more of an angle. But
Yeah.
it gives, I think it shows well the concept of carving out, though, and quarrying out, which I'm sure we'll get to in a second. I just wanted to ask Dan, this is the kind of baseline that geoarchaeologists need to do. They need to understand the local rock, in a sense, to then be able to apply that to building materials. What does this tell you about the Sphinx itself?
What I love when I come to a site is when that site has some sort of stratigraphy that was excavated into. So I've worked in particular on a Bronze Age cemetery in southern Greece, where we came in and we looked. There was all sorts of different colors on the stones, and there was debates. Was this burning? Is this ash? Is this charcoal? Well, turned out that you had all sorts of different ancient gravels that had been stained with manganese, and the white was just from carbonate deposits, marly soils. You just had this very, very ancient sort of river and riverbank environment preserved. And as you cut down through, like they did to build the cemetery, not just to dig graves, but they even excavated probably a certain precinct of it. They took that material out and they used it in places. So you could sort of date or get a rough understanding of the chronology based on where they put that soil in other places of the site, relative to how deep they had dug and what they had dug into across the cemetery. And so that's something that's really important to understand when you have any sort of site that has major sort of interaction with rock, the ground, the soil, is that stratigraphy is going to be reflected throughout the site, throughout the built environment, because it's reflected in the stones that are quarried.
Okay.
The Sphinx is exactly like that, where you can look at
Go on.
You can look at the blocks that were quarried out of the Sphinx enclosure. I'd call it a quarry. Were dragged to build the Sphinx temple and part of the Valley temple. And then you can also see, I mean, for a civilization that was very obsessed with aligning things east, west, and north, south, the southern wall of the Sphinx enclosure does not run east-west. It butts up against the causeway that's there. And so that you can use the chronology, then put a rough chronology together and say, well, okay, what came first? So the causeway, based on everything that we're seeing, had to have been there first, or at least it was planned at about the same time that the Sphinx was being made, because that does not run east-west. And the conspiracy theorists, whatever you want to call them, alternative archaeologists, whatever, they never really fully explain why that isn't running east-west, but everything else, they just point out how accurate it is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think Mark Lehner actually published, going back to archaeological context, that the Sphinx enclosure actually cut through part of the earlier installed drainage of that causeway. So it shows that some of that causeway was constructed in advance of the Sphinx itself. So yeah, I think that kind of contextual evidence is really important. We do a lot of relative chronology through stratigraphy, like Dan was describing. And so you can do that for architectural installations like the causeway, the Sphinx enclosure, that kind of stuff. And then you can also do it from geological, the quarries that are providing the stone itself. And so I think that the combining these two is why it's geoarchaeology in a sense. You're applying the laws of stratigraphy both to sort of architectural construction and to the geological natural material that's being quarried out. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Also, to give a little context, I think it's important, in addition to thinking through a geological approach to the stone, one of the things you've talked about several times, Bob, and Dan, you just mentioned, I think, an example of a river in the example you gave, the site you gave, is we should be considering the context of kind of the Nile Valley itself, right? Provides a kind of environmental context for this. And Bob, do you want to really quickly walk through this idea of the green Sahara? In a sense, there's been lots of changes in the landscape over thousands of years and millions of years.
I mean, what a really cool thing to have learned. So there's things that I never knew that when I started all of this. So about every 20,000 years, the Sahara switches between desert and green savanna. And as I pointed out on that slide, there's like 230 of those that have been documented over the last 8 million years. Some thoughts that this goes back 20 million years, and it's all driven by orbital dynamics. So it's the precession of the equinox. So at certain time, and it's also the amount that the Earth tilts, and it's also slight changes in Earth's orbit. So a green Sahara occurs when the northern hemisphere is leaning towards the sun in the summer at the closest approach to the sun. So right now we've got the opposite. So the northern hemisphere is leaning away from the sun, and so we've got winter at the time that we're at our closest approach to the sun, which makes for slightly warmer winters and slightly cooler summers. When you switch it the other way around, you end up with slightly warmer summers and slightly cooler winters. And basically what that does is it heats the air over Europe, and that hot air then rises. As it does, it pulls the monsoons across Africa and turns it green. That's just so amazing. And that's where the people had a really hard time trying to understand where the Egyptian civilization came from. So the people were living in the Nile Valley. Then during the Green Sahara, you can see in the center 2 slides, it's green. The people are living in the Sahara, and they're not in the Nile Valley. And then as it returns to desert, then everyone migrates back into the Nile Valley. And that's when we have the Egyptian civilization being there. If anybody was there earlier, that would have been all washed away. It would have been eroded out, would have been carried into the Mediterranean. So a lot of that evidence, still you'd find stuff on the side. But yeah, so the Green Sahara has been going back and forth like that for millions of years.
Yeah, I just want to share this slide because it's near and dear to me. My dad conducted a survey above Abydos with Devilshevsky and Shannon McFerrin and others. And they were looking for Paleolithic finds, so much, much older than this, and all in the upper desert, totally inhospitable today. They find concentrations of lithics when people were living up there, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherer groups. You can see these lithics, and you can see the wadis in the landscape where former water was. And so this is all we can see this kind of landscape change. And I think that that's really important when we start to think more about the local landscape of the Sphinx. I came across this recent article by Shisha and Kanievsky and others about the Nile waterscapes and how it's changed and how that relates to the construction of the pyramids, because what they argue is they take cores that are local and they can sort of show this change from the African human period, which is when the Green Sahara is, and where the Giza pyramids line up precisely. And they can do that based off of local cores. So this isn't even just understanding the Sahara, the larger landscape. They have cores from the Giza plateau today that show where this Khufu branch ran and how it ran up towards the Sphinx. And so they could transport some stone from afar. And at the same time, it shows how the landscape was totally different at this time, right when this sort of African human period was ending. And so I think that that's really important to consider. How does this Green Sahara sort of really deal with Schock's claims and other people's claims? I've heard you talk about this, Bob.
It's a question that I would really ask them, right? Where you see it says pyramids of Giza, and you look at the Nile levels and you see that there's a low spot right there.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I would ask is because it is, the Sphinx is in the Nile floodplain. So what advanced civilization, if somebody asked me where to put the Sphinx, I would say, don't put it there. You're putting it into the Nile floodplain. It's going to end up getting soaked on occasion, and you've got the wicking groundwater that's destroying it. What were they thinking? That's one of the ways in which I would say you can help date when the Sphinx was made, because it was made during that period when there were lower levels on the Nile. So that helps to date. You couldn't have made it earlier. Well, you certainly couldn't have made it during the Green Sahara period. You could have done it in the previous Sahara period, which is what Schock is basically arguing. And to an extent, West wants to put it back even the previous desert Sahara.
In a sense, it would have just been underwater. It would have been here, wait, I have a fun image.
But even if it's not underwater, why would you put it there?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably, instead of sand covering it, you'd have water covering it, right? It doesn't make sense at all to have it so low 10,000 years ago during the African humid period, right?
So and now we can look at that and look at the Sphinx. If in fact the Sphinx if it had existed, it was not precipitation that fell on it, because all that precipitation would have been funneled down the Nile River, and the Nile would have flows comparable to that of the Amazon. As it is now, the Nile is a very unusual river. It has about as much flow as the Rhine, yet it's the longest river. It's disputed a little bit between the Amazon and the Nile, but it's one of the if not the longest river on Earth, and it has a trickle of the flow that you would expect for a river of that length. And it's during a green Sahara period, it's like a normal river. Today is the unusual part where it has so little flow in it.
Well, and today it's very much managed with canals and other things that make it so that, I mean, even fairly recently, we have photographs of the floods sort of coming up right near Giza's plateau, the Giza plateau. This is from 1880. This was from 1923. And so,
Yeah.
You can see that in some exceptional periods, even recently, it was a very different landscape. But today, the Nile, I've been to Egypt, and it's very, very much managed with different canals going down on either side to deal with the floods so that it doesn't, do anything to Cairo. Because, you have to manage a river like that, like most cities do.
For me, the discovery of the Nilometer was more impressive to me than the Sphinx, and that I've actually been there and to realize, I mean, this is sort of where science starts, because it's a stream gauge. Yeah. And somebody back, 4,500 years ago or so realized that if you keep measuring things, you can predict future performance based on past performance. Mm-hmm. And just like, I'm in awe of that. and we have that data that shows that the highest level in like the 1880s, I can't remember, it was like 21.4 meters above sea level. And the Sphinx itself, the floor of the Sphinx excavation is at 20 meters. So that means the Sphinx was an island surrounded by 1.4 meters of Nile floods. And yeah, it's in the floodplain.
Yeah. And there's definitely a branch that we can document. Dan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just because Bob mentioned sort of the science and predicting things, and we already went through the sort of the Sahara dispersals. I just wanted to give a call out to Nabta Playa, the stone circle, which a lot of archaeological explanations suggest is actually a calendar to help them figure out when the wet season is coming down. Before they had the Nilometer, they were tracking it with the sun. Some people argue the stars, but there's always some iffiness over determining how things are working with stars other than our sun. It's a long tradition that leads to the founding of Egypt, of learning and predicting.
So one of the things that for me that the Hancock and all those people always point out is that you've got the alignment. It runs east-west. So yeah, and then they say, well, it must align with Leo, which proves that, at the sunrise, because that's what it's facing. But if you look at the Nilometer data, you'll see that the Nile rises in August. And so that is a tie-in to Leo that you don't have to redate everything. It's not really my area. That's more, the archaeologist, but I'm seeing that. And you have depictions in Europe of fountains and all over the Mediterranean with lions dispensing water. So I mean,
look, every time there's a lion that's facing eastish does not mean that it was built when the procession set it up so Leo was in that area of the sky during the equinox. That's just belies belief. The Egyptians built many things facing north, south, or east, west. And this obviously is in relation to the pyramid itself, right? This is how the entire complex is. And
there are so many references associating pharaohs with lions. I mean, it's almost it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that this is in relation with each other. These are mortuary complexes, monumental complexes. And if we go back to this aerial photo, I really like this aerial photo because unlike many aerial photos, it actually gives a sense of relief where this plateau sort of is that's carved out. And so you can see how it's organized as a single unit. Right, you can see this causeway coming down to where the Sphinx is right over here. And what's really cool to me is you can even see where these quarries are cut out, right? To actually quarry out the limestone that much of these pyramids, at least their core, is built out of. And so this comes from the stones of the pyramid by Clem and Clem. And you can see here where these quarries are. There's one that goes all the way up towards the Sphinx. There's some for Khufu, some for Menkaure, different quarries that are cut out, right? And I think it's what these scholars and others, Lehner and others, Egyptologists, they've been documenting sort of the terracing of this plateau in order to build the pyramids on, and how the terracing activity itself is going to provide blocks for it, as well as these kind of quarries. And then, of course, they've done geochemical analyses of the stones themselves to sort of say which quarry different stones came from. And so we can tell that for the pyramid of Khafre, they came from this eastern area right near the Sphinx, right? That's what the sort of markers sort of show, the chemistry of the stones themselves, just like what Dan described at Daskalio. They've done this here. They know where these stones come from, and it's right by the Sphinx. And this is what one of these quarries looks like, right? Look at this quarry right here, the western part of the main quarry. Look at the weathering or the erosion, the rough surfaces. It looks exactly like the Sphinx, doesn't it?
It does. It's the same layer.
It's the exact same layers, same roughness, same sort of image on it. Look at them compared. They look exactly alike. And so this really demonstrates that what we're looking at is a quarry in many ways, right? This is kind of what I at least am seeing. And I know, Bob, you've talked a little bit about sort of how we can understand the stones were taken out. Yeah.
Well, to me, it was, if you look online, you'll see where I went all the way and looked at the geology, the history of the limestone from the Eocene to the Anthropocene, as I call it. And after I was done with all of that, I was like, I can't find a reason why the rock looks like that as a geologist. And I was extremely frustrated. And I finally went back to rewatch the episode of Nova that at first got me into all of this. And there I see Mark Lehner is attempting to carve with a sculptor, there you go, a new nose. But he's holding up the tools. So in his right hand, he's got a two-handed pounder, and the other hand, it's covered up a little bit, is a stone hammer. And so a 200 pounder is just a larger rock, and you take and you pound on the rock with that. The stone hammer is a little bit smaller. They cut notches in it, and they put sticks on it tied together with leather, I believe, and then pound with that. And then they use copper chisels just for the detailed work. And that's when I went, oh, that's not erosion. I'm as a geologist, this is where I guess I am a little bit of a geoarchaeologist. I finally went, no, that's not erosion. That's impossible. Again, right at the neck, I'm like, that's impossible for that to be erosion. And that's when I understood how it was made. And I knew already that those layers were softer, and in particular the layer at the neck being the softest because it was deposited during the Middle Eocene climatic optimum. So that would have been eroded twice. The oceans became so acidic, as I'm seeing it, that instead of depositing limestone, it was actually dissolving the limestone. And to some extent, the limestone right at the neck was being altered, was being weathered by that acidic ocean. And then as the ocean slowly returned to normal acidity, then limestone deposition again began, but this time without the fossils. So that's why I was like, okay, I figured it out. It's not erosion.
So the neck looking different has nothing to do with erosion or with even, it's just the way, it's the consistency, the density of the stone itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's so soft in places, you can crumble it in your fingers. So how could you possibly have carved a rock that's that soft into a statue.
Don't go to the Sphinx and crumble it in your fingers, please.
We're not advocating for any action.
We're not advocating for anything like that.
So as
Dan-
a geologist, I'd like to do that.
Dan, what are your thoughts on some of this research here about the stone and how it relates to quarrying or whatnot?
So right, we kind of have to distinguish talking about the Sphinx body and then the wall of the Sphinx enclosure a bit, right? And that's Bob, sort of your point is that one is more reflective of natural processes, whereas the Sphinx body is reflective of human processes, anthropogenic.
Well, not so much really, because the lower layers, you look at that photo right there,
Yeah.
that's all been covered with block.
Yeah.
The rear paws are actually carved out of the natural limestone. And those blocks are recent additions. So,
but this is all new stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just the difference between where you see these sort of steps, which I understand the argument is that this is just like the ridge that runs under the Great Pyramid. This is just carved into relief to accept casing stones, right, or bricks.
Without question, well put.
And whereas and this is a technology we know. The Egyptians did this. This is how the Egyptians made cased and faced architecture. This is as Egyptian as brickwork is Roman. This is everything. Every building you see there has a core of something rougher, sometimes natural rock. So under the Great Pyramid, there's a small hill that they did not level. And you can see in places around the periphery where they have carved into the bedrock to accept the stones. And then on all of these other buildings we see around, there are what we call core blocks that are then designed and carved to accept facing stones. This is the whole Egyptian architectural technology.
Yeah, which Hawass argued back in 1993 in a sense that this is quarried out. Parts of it were finished nicely, like the head and some of the paws and tail or whatnot. And then this whole middle area, which as Bob is saying is a different quality of limestone, was left roughly and then finished with these blocks. You can see the different sort of covering stones that have been studied and dated based on style. And so certainly Zahi at least thinks phase one would be back the original construction. There's a big debate among Egyptologists about that, but I think Bob, you've come down on the very first facing blocks being as part of the original installation.
Well, it would almost have to be, because there's the major fissure runs across the Sphinx, and that's where, if you go back to that quote from Zahi, I'm puzzled by what he's saying, because it makes it, I think he stated it as clear as possible right there that there were blocks applied, but then he also, in that same paper, will continue and talk about there was enough time, 1100 years, for the erosion to have occurred. So it's kind of confusing what he's saying. But that the blocks were put there at the very beginning, and that when Thutmose IV came along, instead of repairing erosion, I think he was replacing blocks that were looted.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just like the pyramids themselves, we can see bits of the capstones, we can see bits of the nice granite covering. What it's hiding, of course, is the more rougher blocks, which the capping is now gone. The nice covering's now mostly been looted for other constructions in Cairo later on. And we're left seeing the sort of roughened blocks. And you can see also with the sort of this image of the Sphinx itself, the different member stones, and you can see how it almost corresponds to what's carved out nicely versus what's left rough and covered with better stone. Right? In a sense, I think that is a clear geological explanation for why we see the Sphinx as it looks today.
So as archaeologists, you could come in and say, because I'm saying then that the looting occurred in that 1100-year period. And now, does that make sense? Does the archaeological evidence indicate that looting was occurring at that time? I don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah, looting's tough to date. That's one of the tough things to date. But it's probably happening continuously, to be honest.
some people, and I literally just, not to bring up his name yet again, but I literally just heard this sort of argument in Fingerprints of the God, Graham Hancock, where he says, oh, if these were tombs, if these were such important buildings, then why would they be put where they looted? Why would people loot them? Why would people take stone out? And I think something people forget is that it's a long period of time.
Yeah.
The intermediate period Egyptians are not that connected in terms of demographic or chronology to the early Old Kingdom Egyptians, and then you expand that all the way to the New Kingdom, and you're really talking about effectively different nations, different. I mean, the past is a different country, right? You can't argue that these things wouldn't be robbed out simply because they should have had some sort of importance.
To me,
you don't know that. It's a historian's fallacy.
To me, it's the why was there looting? And Hancock and a lot of other people always point out, they're saying, the quality of the pyramids went down. Well, it wasn't because their construction quality went down. It's because they ran out of high quality material to make things from. And so what are you going to do if you're looking at these blocks that you're not historically connected to them anymore? And you're like, hey, I can build something out of that.
Oh, this happens all the time. All over the world, blocks from earlier periods are reused in later construction. We have whole churches in Athens made out of, inscriptions and reliefs from far earlier in the earlier Greek or Roman period. And so, this kind of, we call it spolia, the reuse of architectural members in other buildings. And so spoliation is extremely common, happens in every period. And I mean, when it comes to sort of Egypt, obviously, they go through different cultures and periods of what to do to honor their dead. Sometimes they do underground, sometimes above ground. And there's different solutions in different periods because this is thousands of years. I mean, remember, Cleopatra is closer to us than to these pyramids behind me in time. It's a long friggin' time that we're talking about, many, many generations.
And talking about resources too, not just the reuse, but also the overuse of resources. Something interesting turns up when you look at the carbon dates from Giza is that that they did with the large radiocarbon study. The Middle Kingdom and the later dates fit very well to the known chronology, and they're very successive. The Old Kingdom dates are a little bit all over the place by a couple hundred years. Now, does this mean that the pyramids were all built at the same time? No, what it likely means is that there's an old wood effect going on, that there's use of wood that was all felled at a particular point in time, or even burned to make charcoal at a particular point in time. And then this is used throughout the next couple hundred years. And this is the best explanation as to why you have this localized sort of chaoticity in the radiocarbon record, specifically focused around the like Fourth Dynasty Giza works. And
I think it's the aliens playing tricks on us. They brought down the limestone from Mars, from all the shellfish that live on Mars, and then they felled that wood. It's the amount of time it took for the wood to be transported from Mars.
I like my explanation slightly. That's not my explanation. It comes from the team that did the dating survey, but I like their explanation slightly better.
I think, Flint, you forgot to mention they did that using sound.
Yes, they use sound
levitation and just a little bit of magic mushrooms.
But no, I think that the discussion we're having is important because it does show that there's a lot of different scientific approaches we can take. We can speculate all we want on the kind of when these blocks were looted or not. But at the same time, we have very clear stylistic relative chronology evidence that shows the building of the pyramid. We have the clear evidence for climate change and the African humid period, which Schock does not mention in his publications on this, which should refute an earlier date to begin with. And then lastly, we have the evidence that most of this rough surfaces, it resembles quarrying. from elsewhere. And we know that this area was being quarried because of that stone sourcing that we have from the geosciences of the pyramids. This area was being quarried out for these blocks in the pyramids. And so, I mean, we do have all these independent lines of evidence that really say, the story we're told seems real.
I just want to point out that chalk actually is dependent upon the African humid period. He doesn't really call it that, but that's the evidence of the precipitation that he's saying. So he's saying, you can't actually date the age of the Sphinx, but because it was eroded by precipitation, it must have existed during the African humid periods, basically what he's saying, although he doesn't use that term. And that proves that it's 12,000 years old, or if not older. So he is actually dependent upon the African humid period, but that didn't just fall on the Sphinx. It fell over all of Africa, which would have flooded the Sphinx enclosure with the higher water levels. And on top of that, if water is flowing into this quarry, well, it would cut plunge pools. It would cut at the bottom. Water doesn't cut back on the slope. It undermines the slope, and then it cuts, and then it collapses in that sort of an environment. So his depiction is wrong, but he is really dependent upon the African humid period to date that it is older.
Well, if I can ask you a pointed question, because this is, I think, important to the discussion with everyone, and I like it from, I'm a geoarchaeologist, you're a geologist. People won't take it from my mouth. They might take it from yours. Can you look at an eroded surface without taking into account the timing of it, the surrounding geomorphology, and say, this is wind, this is precipitation, this is a river? Just sort of in the way that chalk has done. Can you just give a single sort of, take a single diagnostic and go, this is absolutely precipitation-related erosion?
Yeah, I mean, in general, you could look at something and say that, yeah, it was caused by precipitation. The Sphinx does not bear that at all.
Rillenkarren are something that you can see. It's coming down from gravity on things like limestone. I've come across it at Korfos Kalamianos in Greece. And so we had a geologist, Rick Dunn, studying the Rillenkarren, very carefully measuring them all, trying to actually figure out if we could estimate the rate of erosion, in a sense. And so that's something that, having worked with Rick, it intrigued me, because that's not what these guys are doing. They're just saying there is erosion, and I'm going to tell you when it dates to. And it's like, exactly. That's not how it works, because it depends on the local material, depends on your understanding of climate, how rapidly things erode, depends on so many local contextual variables that,
and for people watching, Flynn, I just point out with the Rillenkarren, I mean, these are marks that literally look like the pathways of raindrops in many ways. They occur in karstic limestone geology, and but my point with this is exactly that, is that there is still some context necessary, and Rillenkarren are an incredibly specific example. So you have to have very certain circumstances to get the geology that produces such an obvious precipitation-based pattern. And when you get coarser geology, like you might have in these sort of variable limestones.
So one of the things that Schock points out to thinking about erosion is he points to the sidewalls of the enclosure as having been vertical. I don't know that there's any evidence for that. And I would argue that if I were going to build the Sphinx, I wouldn't want vertical walls. I'd want sloping walls so you can actually see it from the causeway, for instance, as opposed to if it were squared, you'd be walking up the causeway and barely even see it. So he's making some assumptions. I don't know anybody can say with any certainty whether it was vertical or sloped. And if you had it sloped, it would be roughly the same slope as on the pyramids behind it. So yeah, I mean, there's so many assumptions being made here, and they're just assumed to be true, and then it's like this gotcha. See?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked all the time, what do you think about the erosion on the Sphinx? And I'm just like, you can't date things from erosion. I've been on a lot of archaeological sites. I've read a lot of archaeological literature. I cannot think of a single other example where dating is done by erosion. If anything, if for such precise periods of time as we're talking about archaeologically, like with the example I mentioned at Corfos Kalamianos, we'd use archaeological dates to demonstrate how in that local area we could look at Rillenkarn and date them. But I've never heard of sort of like, let's date this monument from erosion. Like, that's just not how archaeological dating's done. We have large data sets, millions of radiocarbon dates from around the world. We now have uranium, thorium dating. We have stylistic dating of thousands of potsherds. We have quantity that we use to date things, not just one exceptional example. And so,
Did you include the tomography? This is Schock actually trying to date the Sphinx with erosion, and he's failed, even though I've talked to some people and they said this is what they thought was the greatest piece of evidence. I'm like, no, it proves him 100% wrong. So what this is seismic tomography, and it's much like a CAT scan if you're familiar with that. But a CAT scan is looking at changes in intensity on an X-ray, and what he's measuring here is he's measuring differences in arrival times. And so the more weathered the limestone is, the lower the seismic velocity. And that's a very good assumption to make. And so his premise was that if you came here, and you can see the outline of the Sphinx. So the premise is that if the Sphinx was carved 12,000 years ago, then the floor of the exposed floor of the quarry next to the Sphinx should have the lowest seismic velocities because it's been weathered. And the limestone that's directly beneath the Sphinx should have the highest seismic velocities because it was protected from weathering and erosion by the Sphinx itself. So that's his premise here. So if you look at anomaly D, that's a high velocity anomaly. That's where he said you should see the lowest seismic velocity is in the exposed part of the quarry. So that alone proves that he's wrong. And that's anomaly A. And so what Schock is saying is that is in fact the Hall of Records. And he's measured the Hall and that low velocity zone is indicative of this void at depth. But he did this at the level of the Sphinx. So he hit the hammer here and he picked it up here. So it is only measuring seismic velocities at the level of the Sphinx enclosure. It has no capability, none whatsoever, to measure the seismic velocities at depth. If he had done downhole tomography, if he had done something like that, then yes, but he didn't do that. So that is not the Hall of Records. It shows that the lowest seismic velocities are actually beneath the Sphinx. They're not tunnels and they're not the Hall of Records. And his whole premise is wrong. He just proved himself wrong, but he instead was like, oh yeah, well, that's the Hall of Records.
Dan, anything you want to add about that?
I wasn't really familiar with that argument, and having you explain it like that, it's so strange that he kept going with these claims. I genuinely don't have anything else to add there.
And there's a lot more geophysics that have been done on the Giza Plateau since then, and it's like none of this is confirming their arguments. But yeah, okay, this is good. I think that it's important that we take these kind of interdisciplinary tacks towards A, solving actual archaeological questions, and B, sort of combating this kind of pseudoscience narratives that exists around us. Any last thoughts? Dan, do you want to go first?
Oh God. Yes. I mean, just general sort of Jerry Springer-esque summation, or
whatever you want to say to end.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor. I've been aware of this discussion for some time. I think I was first exposed to Graham Hancock and other things, like even Ignatius Donnelly and other sort of the beginnings of conspiracies back when I was a teenager. And as I slipped into becoming an archaeologist and became more and more aware that there really were like full-grown adults who believed this and that there was quite a big push behind it. It always frustrates me because what I do for a living as all archaeologists do it, but as a geoarchaeologist, context is king. and it's the job of every archaeologist to look for context, and it's sort of geoarchaeologists were sort of the context consultants, or the surgeons who come in for the tricky bits. And as I've learned more and more about what to do what I do, I've got more and more frustrated, because what's actually fascinating about all this stuff is how the context links together. When you look at the overlapping of the architecture, so for example, how the Sphinx temple obliterates part of the Khafra Valley temple enclosure wall. When you look at, then we have a pretty secure radiocarbon date from one of the columnar niches in the Khafra Valley temple that is three dates on one sample that, when you put them into Oxcal, gives you 2500 BCE on the nose, plus or minus whatever, but it doesn't matter. Your center date's beautiful. And then you expand this out. Then you look at what Lehner and others have done, actually looking at what layers of the geologic members the stones come from, to the point where they even can see that there wasn't even so much stone up top in the top level near the head, that because there's so very few stones that are incorporated from that final member, which perhaps supports Farouk Al-Baz's suggestion that there were some yardangs or eroded surface features, although we'll never really know. But you start to process all of this out, and you can build quite a convincing and picture that is not supported on one line of evidence or two lines of evidence. It's built on 15 lines of evidence that all interact and at multiple points. And that's what I'm hoping in going forward with any of these discussions on whether it's pseudoarchaeology or just archaeology in general, is like, that's the fun part. And that's what I want to share with people, is when you click, you don't need this Dan Brown style adventure with secret civilizations and organizations chasing you down shady hallways in Rome. You can just start piecing together the geology and piecing together how the humans lived in that region. And it does click, much like a codex from the Da Vinci Code. But
you just totally undermined everything you just said with that.
Listen, they're good books, even if conspiracy theories are dangerous. Dan Brown, his name is Dan, and he's from New Hampshire. I like him.
Fair enough. All right, and Bob, how about you? How would you like to end this?
Well, I want to start by saying something, because this is all about you getting ready, in a sense, for the debate that's coming up in October.
To a certain degree, yeah.
To a certain extent, and I want to point out that I actually shook hands with Randall Carlson in Mexican Hat, Utah 2 years ago, and he agreed to go toe to toe with me, and I've never heard from him since. So I'm waiting for the debate.
Randall, if you're listening, come on, let's do this.
Let's do this. What's really interesting because it was Rogan who proposed the debate, and Carlson said, "You won't find anyone." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" So anyways, getting back to all of this, I want to just point out, I'm not sure that, I think everyone's a little bit different on the way they're approaching it. I think Graham Hancock is looking for an alternative story. Whether he actually believes this alternative story or not, I don't know. I think he just is trying to invent a really cool, in his mind, story that is plausible. Not that it's real, but that it's plausible. And then others, like Robert Schoch, really believes that he has evidence for a lost civilization. So you need to approach all of these people a little bit differently and how what they believe, because they're not all the same. So the other thing that I want to point out is that David Miano and I are working on a paper which is going to be looking at how the Sphinx was actually made. And he just challenged me about a month or so ago on something. I was like, that can't be done. But it turns out it was done. And so I think he's made it a much better paper. So we're working on that. And our plan is to get you a draft of that before your debate, so you can see it. I think it's going to be, I don't know if it's a gotcha moment, but it's definitely something that's pretty good. So, yeah, that's my take on it.
No, you're good. I think that you made the point that you want to debate Randall Carlson very clearly. And
Well, he said he would.
and no, but I
Watch
think
that.
I think the key thing here is just the quantity of evidence that exists in the natural world and in the sort of human world. We have these narratives that are built on not just one monument like the Sphinx, but based on all of Egyptology that has happened. And so, I think that that's really, really key. It's what I always go back to is, the archaeological record, there's millions of sites out there. And we have a pretty good handle on things like stylistic chronology, radiocarbon chronology, uranium thorium dating. We have been doing this for a while. And so, to go and say based off of this monument here and this monument there, that there's a lost civilization that archaeologists have been ignoring. Well, yeah, we can't radiocarbon date the Sphinx. Okay, sure. But as Dan pointed out, we got 15 lines of evidence that are all pretty dang consistent. And the one piece of evidence, this erosion or weathering, that it's older, it doesn't seem to hold up to scrutiny. It's not clear at all. It's not been published in any way beyond a little bit of seismic data, right? The rest of it's not been published in a clear peer-reviewed manner. And so I think it's important to always emphasize the quantity of evidence we have, the dozens of representations of pharaohs that look like the Sphinx from the same period, the dozens of stones, hundreds of stones, thousands of stones that were taken out of the quarry there, and et cetera, all the work that's been done. We have a lot of evidence, not just a little, but a lot, more than I or anyone else could come to grips with even. So yeah, okay. Thank you both for joining me, and I'm going to hit stop recording.